This is The Common Health from the CSIS Bipartisan Alliance for Global Health Security, engaging senior leaders on questions of how to address our common health security challenges in this post-COVID moment. I'm delighted today to be joined by a friend and colleague here at CSIS, Noam Unger. Thanks for joining us, Noam.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Noam is the director of the Sustainable Development and Resilience Initiative at CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies, and a senior fellow with the Project on Prosperity and Development. He came to us having served as vice president in Interaction, and prior to that served in a variety of policy leadership positions at USAID. This interview is really part of a series looking at climate change, looking some on the health dimensions, some on the broader outcomes of the COP. Today we're going to talk about adaptation a bit. We had Joe Mykut come and talk to us as a climate scientist on his outlook of what happened in COP28. I want to start today, Noam. You published a very nice commentary on the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, what's called PEPFAR, that was rolled out by the Biden administration early in their first year at the Glasgow COP in 2021. Let's talk about this initiative. Tell us a bit about the genesis of it. What are the primary pillars and focus? What does it mean to have an adaptation and development focus?
Well, I think it's important to sort of understand it in the context of the adaptation has been part of the conversation in climate conversations for many years. People often think of it in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And if you look at the Paris Agreement from 2015, people talk about supporting and financing our transition to a decarbonized sort of economy and society. And they talk about dealing with the impacts of climate change. And the latter is really what we're talking about. We're talking about adaptation and resilience.
And adaptation, there's a lot of different things that fall under it. You know, you can point to all sorts of things that could change, that would improve your defenses against the harmful impacts of climate change. What are the main items that fall under it when we're talking about adaptation as part of a diplomatic and international strategy?
So adaptation is often, I think most commonly, people start talking about it in the context of food systems and water security. But pretty quickly, people are also, as your program is well aware, talking about it as a health issue. And people also think of it in terms of infrastructure. The reality is that societies around the world have to adapt and become more resilient in the face of changing climate. And what I'm most interested in is how climate change is impacting the least developed countries. Because, by estimates, there are basically over 3 billion people across the world living in the most vulnerable areas with regard to climate change impacts. And what does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things, but at the end of the day, one thing it means is just more deaths, more health impacts on people from climate change. So we have to adapt and become more resilient. There are a lot of ways in which you do that. Some of that actually even has to do with governance and finance systems and insurance. So there's a real range of what we mean when we're talking about adaptation and resilience, and it's pretty context specific. But in the context of climate negotiations and diplomacy, for many years, those discussions have been almost entirely dominated by issues around mitigation, about, transitioning from carbon, about methane, about greenhouse gas emissions, and how do we, move towards cleaner technology. And there's really great reason for why that's been a priority, because that is about stopping the damage that we're doing globally that's leading to climate change. But on the other hand, even if we're successful against these ambitious targets that we've laid out internationally around mitigation. And we're not on track, actually, with regard to sort of, 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're not on track by a lot of measures with regard to mitigation. But even if we were on track with those ambitious goals, for many decades, we're talking about massive impacts on people's way of life, massive impacts on health and food and water and infrastructure.
So why did it take so long for adaptation to rise to become a near equal priority? I mean, there was a COP back in 2009 that elevated it somewhat. It's taken a long time for it to get this kind of near equivalence of priority. What's the source of hesitation?
It's an interesting question. In some ways, I would challenge the question because I'm not even convinced that it is a near equal priority now. But
rhetorically,
that's true. It's been growing. I think it's poised to grow, and we can talk about that. I think that in many ways, the answer to your question leads back to the challenges in engaging on the mitigation front. It is obviously very important to mitigate the damage that humans are doing around the world and societies and our entire industry is doing. And that's been more challenging than it should have been. I mean, the fact that at this past year's COP in Dubai, the big sort of headline was that transitioning from fossil fuels has now been acknowledged as a priority. That's a really low bar. And yet that was considered the big success. So I just think that progress has been slower on the mitigation side than it should have been. And as a result, it has crowded out focus. But I also think that in the world of people focused on climate change, it's been sort of broadly viewed or understood as distracting or even defeatist to focus on the climate change impacts and adaptation and resilience side of things instead of focusing on the mitigation challenges.
I think that's a fundamental reason that people have been inclined to not focus on adaptation because it feels like you're taking your eye off the ball.
It feels like you're throwing your arms up in the air to a certain extent.
So you had to get to a point where you could keep both ideas in your head and say, moving forward on both fronts is a very valid and smart strategy versus we don't have time for the adaptation because we've got this urgent requirement in front of us. It's almost like talking about recovery and reconstruction in Gaza today. You've got a roiling crisis in front of you. People are inclined to say, well, maybe we'll put this off later. I think there's another reason too, and certainly true on health, which is, the impacts of extreme heat and other forms of extreme weather on health are kind of self-evident. The need for changes in built environment, the need for changes in health infrastructure in order to deal with that. The rise of infectious diseases as climate has changed has also been documented.
I mean, it's self-evident. People get it, but it also requires massive changes, too, in how health systems are approaching this, how these things are, where the funding is coming from. There are projections, just coming back to the overlap with health, there are projections from the WHO that basically say that from malaria, diarrhea, malnutrition, and heat stress alone, right, between 2030 and 2050, there would be about 250,000 excess deaths a year for those years, which totals up to about 20 million additional deaths beyond and above sort of the norm over that time. And there have been other...
And even those numbers are old and now...
I think those numbers are undercounting. I mean, those are just a few impacts that they're citing, and they're also not actually really talking about a lot of the other indirect impacts. So, I mean, we're talking about major.
But to get back to why would there be hesitation in the health sector to take up the adaptation agenda, one obvious thing is climate change is a politically polarized topic. And so if you have an agenda, if you have an established agenda over the last 20 years in global health around infectious diseases and maternal and child health and immunizations and the like, and you've got strong bipartisan support for that. And coming on the other side of COVID, there's a great fear that the interest in this sector is waning, and sustaining progress and getting back to where you were before COVID struck is a huge question. Taking on this new thing seems like a bridge too far and a threat because you're going to invite the fights into the arena. And then you have the climate thing is so expansive that people are like, wait a second, what are we stepping into, right? Because even in your piece, you point out, well, maybe 40 billion a year is a good number for thinking about what the requirements might look like for adaptation, and maybe 3 billion a year is kind of a good number to think about what the U.S. contribution might be. But then you point out, but others are saying we need 215 to 367 billion per year. I mean, these things balloon astronomically in a heartbeat. And I think that fact also leaves people to go, wait a second, what are the boundaries? Where are the boundaries to this? And what is really most important and affordable and feasible? And what are we supposed to pick off as our spots here? So let's get back to okay, the Biden administration decides to put a framework forward to try and bring some boundaries and some definition to elevate adaptation and development as a priority. How successful have they been? Have they mobilized finance? Have they clarified their priorities? Have they built bipartisan support for this?
So the Biden administration came in, focused pretty early on challenges of adaptation alongside mitigation and overall elevated climate in a big way. I mean, keep in mind, they were coming on the heels of an administration that had pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. So that was a sort of day one issue. But then, as you said, later on that very first year, at that year's COP in Glasgow, the administration announced, didn't really unveil or unfold all the details of what would be PREPARE, the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience. And the next year in Sharm el-Sheikh, they unveiled more of an action plan around it. And I would say they've actually done a good job of clarifying what the focus is and their approach. I think that action plan, incidentally, as somebody who sat in government and tried to write sort of policies and action plans for strategies, it's actually quite a good one in terms of how it is laid out. And yet we have to be realistic. This is essentially a presidential initiative that's not coming with a big bag of money along with it. And so it's structured as a coordination initiative across many different agencies. It's led by USAID and State Department, but it actually reaches so many different parts of the government. I mean, NASA in terms of satellites, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. There's all these different parts of the government that are engaged. And it's
calling it a coordination mechanism can also be kind of the kiss of death, can it?
Well, I think it's the right direction, right? I mean, what you're trying to do is actually leverage the strengths of the U.S. government to bring our expertise to bear on a major issue. And they're using the adaptation as this broad frame, which is also, we can come back to that, but that's interesting. The focus is very much on things like climate information systems. And, you know, the U.S. actually has strengths in this way. The U.S. is very large and it covers a lot of different territories and climates and has invested a lot in data and awareness of its own sort of vulnerabilities to climate variances. And so through our research and university systems, our airports, so much infrastructure that we have, we've got expertise in areas of climate information. Other countries, not so much. And so the US can actually pull together a lot of data and information that can help countries with early warning, with better information at a more detailed level. We can bring the innovation of satellite imagery and sort of data analysis tools to helping farmers measure sort of and predict humidity and how that'll affect their grains.
We are doing that increasingly with partner governments.
Exactly. We're doing that with partner governments. We're doing that through different agencies, and we're tapping into sort of the innovation and science components of federal government on that side of things. So part of it is about sort of planning and early warning systems. Part of it has to do with mainstreaming adaptation approaches through a few different areas: food, water, health, infrastructure. And part of it has to do with mobilizing other actors, sort of the private sector and international actors.
So there's a focus on the data forecasting. There's a focus on getting indicators better refined for use. Focus on 4 or 5 things: food, water, health, infrastructure, meaning the built environment mostly.
That's right.
And then some finance and insurance things. I mean, the insurance thing is quite interesting.
It's super interesting because at a certain level, you know, insurance companies need to make money. And when you've got sort of these cataclysmic impacts, if you're not diversified enough in terms of your risk pool, you're going to get killed. And so for insurance mechanisms to work, they have to be really sort of broad and diverse and scaled up. But insurance can bring a lot to the table in terms of different impacts for agriculture, for example.
Just as an aside, my family lived on Long Beach Island off the southern coast of New Jersey, had a home for 45 years. And
how'd that work out?
When Sandy hit 13 years ago, the National Program of Insurance for coastal areas was going through a 25-year reform process. And it was pretty chaotic. The impact on many, many lives, and of course the impact subsequent in terms of how people rebuilt their homes, dramatically driven by insurance considerations.
Absolutely. And that's for people, that's dramatically driven by insurance considerations for people who are already sort of availing themselves of insurance mechanisms and bought into the concepts of insurance. And around the world, in a lot of cases, that's not the case. I mean, we need to sort of build that up. But you're right. I mean, so it ranges from sort of financial and insurance issues to built environment issues to health to ag.
In your writing, you draw a comparison or you reference the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was launched in the State of the Union address January of 2003 by then President George W. Bush. And of course, it's gone on to become, the flagship program, Global Health. 115 billion expended, 25 million people on life-sustaining therapy, and on and on. And it's been twinned with the Global Fund. And now you have these sort of structures there when you look at the Global Fund, PEPFAR, the Gavi Vaccine Alliance. You have these entities that are more than 2 decades old, that are structural realities that have had profound impact in low and middle income countries in terms of health and are going to continue to be in that role. But let's think a bit about, just comparatively, about what gave PEPFAR its dramatic impact, and then do a little comparison with the current realities. In the case of PEPFAR, we had one disease that we were most concerned about.
It was very focused, yeah.
And of course, most people died of tuberculosis. But we had this really dangerous disease that was sweeping through southern and eastern Africa in particular. So it was a concentrated geographic scourge. And it was having verifiably destabilizing impacts. And the National Intelligence Council and others started doing all these assessments and putting all this stuff forward through the intelligence channels about what this was all going to mean. So you had a strategic threat. And you had a White House, in the form of President George Bush, pick this up and label it as a strategic threat and throw it into his State of the Union address, twinned with the invasion of Iraq. So you had 9/11 as the big strategic moment. And what's our response to 9/11 is infectious diseases are now a bigger problem and a bigger threat. And we also have this thing called Iraq, and we're going to invade Iraq. So that speech had 2 main messages to it. So you had a kind of strategic formulation in the launch of this, coming from the president himself with real money, $15 billion over 5 years, but also 15 countries, like a sort of standardized geography, small set of countries. And it enjoyed a very unusual and surprising coalition, right? Because it brought forward,
it developed over time, but that's right.
But over time, it acquired evangelical Christians. It acquired industry. Industry had come forward as of 96 with the antiretrovirals. Industry figured out how to move under pressure, how to move towards access and generic access and mass production. Industry became an advocate. Philanthropies jumped in big time, most importantly, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then in Congress, you had bipartisanship around this.
Wasn't that nice?
Which remained foundational to all of this. So how does that all size up today? Is adaptation seen as a strategic threat? Do we have a White House willing to sort of pick this up and throw it into a State of the Union address? We have a State of the Union address coming up tomorrow. Are they willing to put real money in it? I mean, we had the IRA put $370 billion into climate change and industrial and reinvention and the like. As far as I can tell, there was no connection between that and PREPARE in terms of financing and political will and the like. And it's not a single disease. It's, as we pointed out, it's 4 or 5 things that you can point to. So in your view, you raised this comparison. And I think my read was you raised it because you wanted to say, look, one's called PEPFAR, one's called PREPARE. They're both presidential initiatives trying to deal with an emerging crisis and challenge. And maybe there's something to learn from it. How far does that go, do you think?
It only goes so far. I mean, I think you're onto something. But I think that, in the piece that I wrote on this, I was really interested in that process of, and you alluded to this, of how the crisis of HIV/AIDS shifted in the minds of U.S. foreign policy leaders, right? Yeah. And so if you go back a little before the time where that State of the Union that you were talking about with Bush, you had a president who actually was tapped into a network that cared about these issues. Mm-hmm. And you also had a growing chorus, including at the UN, that was identifying and framing the challenge of HIV/AIDS, especially in Africa, but also globally, as an international security threat. And you're right, it was more focused. And you're right that PEPFAR was an initiative that had focused countries and came with money.
But on that point also, it was Vice President Gore and Richard Holbrooke who went to the Security Council during the U.S. presidency of the Security Council in the last year of Clinton administration and chaired a session, the first session of the UN Security Council, focused upon a health issue.
That's right.
And that was on HIV. So you had this threshold.
There was a tide that was turning.
Yeah, and it was a consciousness one. It was the data was coming forward. It was the alarm bells were being rung by Kofi Annan. And
That's right. That's right. Jim Wolfenson and others, yeah.
And the U.S. took it and gave it a strategic definition. This was before 9/11. Once 9/11 hit, it got thrown into the stratosphere as a security issue.
And you also had a turnaround in many ways in U.S. civil society, especially U.S. religious and especially evangelicals across the U.S. in terms of how they were viewing and understood this health crisis.
And that was mostly because they began to understand its impact on children and women and the impact on affiliated missions, where you had mission heads of schools and clinics and hospitals coming to the United States on their annual kind of visits to their church affiliates and describing an apocalypse.
And when you were talking about industry, I understood that you were talking about essentially the health and healthcare industry. But in fact, industry more broadly was understandably worried from a labor markets perspective as well, in terms of what, this disease was doing to their workforce. So I do think that there are some parallels broadly, which is why I wrote the piece, that we might be, it's a question, right? We might be at a pivot point now with regard to climate change impacts and issues of adaptation and resilience in terms of how they are understood and viewed. Issues of climate change adaptation have been on the agenda for a while, but in this last year, there were a lot of superlatives. You also had fires in Maui. You had wildfires in Canada that were affecting the air quality in Washington, D.C. Policymakers and politicians here in our country are starting to understand climate change impacts a little differently. And there's also a generational shift, right, over time in terms of how much people are focused on these issues. I think we may be at a point where just as attitudes and the policy priority placed on HIV/AIDS was shifting 24, 25 years ago, we may be at a similar point with regard to climate change adaptation. What's weird, actually, is that we already have a presidential initiative on this issue. It's just come before its time. Usually you don't get that kind of attention from the White House unless you already have an ecosystem that is built up to champion the issue and the frame. And what you have in the space of climate change impacts is you have stovepiped approaches. You've got people who are really deep in the food systems and ag sectors thinking about climate change adaptation. You've got the same in water. You've got the same in health. But the frame of looking at it broadly across all of these spaces, there's not quite the constituency there.
Yeah, that gets to where we know that there's a toxic constituency out there. There's an actively toxic constituency that will take anything like this and turn it into something that bears no resemblance to reality, but which will advance their perceived case. So you have a negative constituency that you have to work against very hard. And that's, that didn't exist in 2003. In 2003, it was a moment of national unity post 9/11.
And there was a lot of bipartisanship, and that has obviously frayed.
Yeah, and the digital era was just beginning. We didn't have we're now 25 years later in terms of the digital world. Do you think, so the PREPARE Act.
Well, it's not an act.
Not PREPARE.
It might one day become a congressional.
PREPARE as an initiative of the Biden administration. It's a framework. It's out there. It may go the way of other initiatives that don't ever kind of catch fire. That's not a terrible risk. It may also provide a basis for doing a lot more over time. Maybe that's what's required in this case, is a more incremental, accumulative or aggregation of action and activity and the like over time that doesn't lend itself to the big burst approach that we had under PEPFAR.
I think that's right. I don't think it's going to look the same. I think that it is what's needed is an incremental approach to build this up, and I think that it will happen. I think that...
Does PREPARE, you said it's co-joined by state and AID, and it's a coordination mechanism, et cetera. So all of those words say to many skeptical...
It's building the framework for something bigger to come. And I think it can. I think ultimately it needs to be sort of institutionalized, and by that I mean through support from Congress that would have to be bipartisan. You were talking about climate being a bit of a lightning rod. And I think that that is absolutely right and still true. And it is also changing over time. I do think that there is a subsection of people who are open to talking about the impacts of weather variability and increasing intensity and severity of storms or heat waves and the like on people, and those impacts on economic security and national security, who might feel comfortable enough with that conversation without getting into the causation issues and decarbonization and fossil fuel companies and all that kind of stuff. And this issue is big enough that you have to be able to do both. Yeah. But we can actually talk about climate adaptation and resilience in a way that resonates, especially since these impacts are hitting in the US. It's just the US has greater ability to be resilient, but we can also export our innovation and our know-how and actually support other countries in a way that is both in our interests in terms of geoeconomics. It's also in our interests in terms of geostrategic competition with other major powers, because as time goes on, the developing countries that are the hardest hit by these climate change impacts and have the least bear the least responsibility for climate change in the first place, they are going to be increasingly putting this on the agenda for superpower countries that are vying for their partnership. And so I think that this is going to sort of continue to build. I think it could build in different ways. If you think about an effort like Feed the Future was a significant effort under the Obama administration that has continued across multiple administrations. Some of these things actually do sort of withstand transitions from one administration to another. The Development Finance Corporation was a creation of the Trump administration that's been embraced and continued in this administration. I think that, in this space of global development, there can be some bipartisan support built up around this. And I think that, especially in this case, there are a lot of economic security implications that need to be highlighted more. I think businesses are going to be interested increasingly in resilience and adaptation issues.
Does PEPFAR draw on the energy of geopolitical confrontation with China and some of our other adversaries? Is it grounded in that?
The PEPFAR framing is not. I mean, I mentioned the Development Finance Corporation, which was actually, through the Build Act, was entirely carried on the shoulders of a frame of geostrategic competition, and yet is not always used in that way. PEPFAR has not been framed that way. I'm not sure it's always helpful, frankly, that it be framed in that way, and yet for certain audiences, that could be what resonates.
Let's close with, where does this go from here? I mean, we're in an election year. We're still in this weird post-COVID phase where behaviors are kind of strange sometimes. People are driving too fast. And they're driving through red lights, and our mortality on the roads is way up. And I mean, there's still some kind of, and I'm sure that some of the kind of exhaustion and amnesia that settled in over COVID spilled in some fashion into trying to get people excited about these big new things. I mean, this was rolled out in the middle of trying to get the vaccine distribution up and running, and we just need to remind ourselves, when President Biden was inaugurated, we lost 3,300 people that day. 3,300 in a single day. We lost over 100,000 people in January of 2021. So, it was not a very good moment then necessarily to carry, because we had this crisis. And then you had the kind of aftermath of that. And so the more time that elapses, it seems to me, from the acute phase, the easier it may become to put a focus on things like we're talking about here in terms of prepare.
Yeah, I think that's right. Unless and until you get hit with the next pandemic. I mean, and how prepared are we? I mean, I do think there are parallels actually between thinking about long-term adaptation and resilience broadly to climate change and thinking about pandemic preparedness. In fact, there's an IMF trust and a category of facilities that exist that are specifically for both of those things, that are for climate change and pandemic preparedness together. Where this goes from here, we're in a weird year, absolutely. And so I think that this year, in many ways, is an opportunity to sort of have dialogue, build up discussions with interested stakeholders for what might come, right? Yeah. A second term of Biden could be what happens, another Trump administration, something else. This year could be very strange in a number of ways. But ultimately, we can't be myopic. These issues of climate change mitigation and adaptation are with us. We have to be engaging intelligently on them through our U.S. foreign policy and all of the tools that we have. And that includes sort of engaging and leveraging the U.S. and global private sector. And I think that that's where I want to focus in particular. And Prepare does this. I didn't mention this, but Prepare has this call to action to the private sector. And so far, more than 30 companies of all different types, insurance companies, construction companies, data analytics companies, financial firms, have stepped up and basically made a number of different commitments. And to your question about mobilization, I think state and USAID have said that has mobilized $2.3 billion just through that. I think there's going to be more of this. I want to explore and talk about the motivations for those private sector concerns around adaptation and resilience and investments in adaptation and resilience, because I think if we frame it that way and talk about that, we'll be talking about economic security in a way that's less threatening across our current weird political divides. And we can have these conversations across what still exists as a political middle in our country and have sane conversations about how it's in our interest to invest in stability and economic security by also helping other countries on their plans and interests in becoming more resilient and adaptive in the face of climate change.
Thank you. All right, let's close with a quick comment around, we ask each of our guests. In this instance, we're talking about adaptation and resilience. What gives you hope? There's plenty of skeptics out there. What gives you hope and optimism looking ahead?
I mentioned the generational thing. I think that, I've got 3 kids. They and their peers are growing up with a sense of pretty persistent concern around climate change and its impact on the world. And yet they themselves are actually finding ways to be optimistic. And I think their whole generation is actually engaged in these issues in a way that to me speaks of the generational change. I think members of Congress turn over. You're going to have generational change eventually. And I think that we need to engage with that dynamism and youth around these issues. And that gives me hope, right? I mean, we are facing pretty, when you deal with the world of climate change impacts, you're dealing with a lot of sort of dark stats, right? A lot of sad stories about projections. But I do have hope that we can invest in and enable greater adaptation and resilience. And it's actually a pretty positive agenda. So it becomes a positive story for U.S. foreign policy if the U.S. can step up to the plate and do this in a big way as a leadership role in the world. And that's what my career's been about. It's like, how do you actually focus on responsible U.S. global engagement? There are really good examples. And health and what we were talking about with PEPFAR and the Global Fund, these are excellent examples. And I think we could be doing something similar in the coming decade and more on adaptation and resilience.
Thank you. Thanks for all your work, and thanks for taking time to be with us.
Thank you.
Today. It's great to have you here at CSIS working on these matters, and I look forward to doing more together with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Marla Hiller, our esteemed producer. Thank you once again. Thank you for listening to The Common Health. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a follow and leave a review. To learn more about the CSIS Bipartisan Alliance for Global Health Security or listen to other CSIS podcasts, please visit csis.org.